like to welcome you to this webinar. We're going to be talking about a closer look at the problem of addictions, looking at it from a biblical perspective. And our guest is Cherri Raws Freeman, Associate of Grace Fellowship, Certified Exchange Life Counselor, and other credentials. But Cherri, we welcome you to the call. We're really glad that you're here, and we invite you to proceed with your presentation.
Thank you, John. It's a privilege to be here. So we're going to be talking about addiction definitions and solutions. And you might wonder what my right is to even talk about this. But I just want to talk about that a little bit. I grew up at the oldest rehab in this country. My great-grandfather founded it in 1897 after he had a not so illustrious career with alcohol. But God miraculously delivered him from that. He was saved, and he spent the rest of his fairly short life working in addiction ministry. So I grew up at a place called America's Keswick, and the Colony of Mercy was the men's ministry there, and now there's Barbara's Place for women. So one would think that I knew a lot about addiction. My grandfather became the director, and then my father became the director after him. I grew up seeing people, men who came to the program, and their lives would be changed, their families would be restored, and it was wonderful. Obviously, not everybody had that kind of story, but it did happen so much. And so I grew up around that. And the men of the colony were our friends. And it didn't seem odd to be around addiction on that end of things. What I didn't understand was truly about addiction until I had 2 of my 5 children go into addiction and almost destroy their lives. And I was bewildered. I thought I knew everything, and I knew nothing. I did not know what to do. I did not know where to go, how to help them, what that looked like. And it really is out of that experience that God birthed a passion in me to really work with the families of those who are in addiction. There are resources that are available for the person who's in addiction, but there was nothing that I could find at that point in time that really helped me understand what was my role, what was my responsibility, what really was going on, why were my kids destroying themselves this way. So addiction not only impacts the person, but it impacts the people around them, the people that love them. The statistics of addiction right now are astonishing. In 2022, there were 110,236 drug overdose deaths in this country alone. Okay, that is beyond belief when we think about it, and it grows each year. The other thing, well, the one thing that was happening, of course, is the opioid addiction problem, the heroin. But with the increase of fentanyl in this country, you now have people who are overdosing on things that they never thought they would overdose on. For example, I know of a man and his girlfriend who overdosed on cocaine because there was fentanyl that was mixed in with it. I know of another guy who graduated from the Colony of Mercy. He had 6 kids, and he was driving a truck, had been up late the night before, so he got some cocaine on the street and drove a couple of feet and died because there was fentanyl again. And so fentanyl has changed a lot of things. It's being included in even pot, where people would think, well, you know, pot's fine. Nobody's going to mix it with that. Yes, they do. And street pain pills, people will think that they're getting the pharmaceutical grade of pain pills, and they're not, and they're getting mostly junk and then a lot of fentanyl mixed in. The other thing that's happening right now is there's a substance called xylazine, and on the street it's known as trank. And you may be hearing reports about this, but this is an animal narcotic, not a narcotic, an animal sedative. So it will be used with large animals such as elephants, things like that. Well, it now has made its way into the drug market. And what's happening is the Narcan cannot reverse it. So the fentanyl may be able to be reversed, but the trank cannot be with Narcan. The other thing is that when it's injected into people, it causes ulceration of the skin and the tissues that it goes into. And people are, and I'm sorry if this is too much for some people to hear, but it causes ulceration to the point of gangrene. And there are many, many people who are now having to have amputations as a result. So if you go on the streets of Kensington, which is it's a division of Philadelphia, which is a place that you don't want to go. It's like the night of the living dead. But you will begin to see more and more and more people who have had amputations because they have shot up with something that has xylazine in it. So we are facing a devastating epidemic of drugs. On top of that, alcohol-related deaths, the latest statistic I looked at was about 95,000 per year. That does not go down. It maybe goes up some, or it stays pretty steady. There's no lack of information about drugs and alcohol. And yet we see this increasing each year. And COVID-19 did a terrible disservice to this country in many, many ways. But one of the things is that people isolated. They were in despair. And so the rates of drug and alcohol use went up precipitously. John, you want to switch to the slides?
Cherri, the statistic about 95,000 related to alcohol, is that deaths?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's not including accidents and other things. The other thing with the drug overdose deaths, because Narcan is so available, we're only seeing the deaths on that. We are not seeing the number of people who actually overdose but are reversed. So there are people who have multiple times been brought back from the brink of overdose deaths because of Narcan. So if you multiply the statistics here, you're going to begin to see the impact of drugs and alcohol these days.
And are they making Narcan available over the counter pretty soon? Yes,
Narcan is available over the counter now, I believe. If not, it will be.
And it's a rescue intervention. I'm going to share my screen. Mark McCann, can you see this this PowerPoint? I know it's a bit tricky sharing with Cherri. Can you see that? You can see it? Okay.
Yes.
All right, Cherri, go right ahead.
Okay. Well, to understand addiction, we need to look at the way that God designed us as humans. We were made in the image of God. And God, as we know, is three parts. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And so when we look at people, for those of you who are not familiar with this wonderful diagram, you can see a depiction of the three parts of mankind. So spirit is the part that relates to God. That's the part that when we are reborn, that's the part that comes into that wonderful relationship that we know with God. We also have soul, which is the part of us that relates to other people. We can think of it as our personality. It involves the mind, the will, and the emotions, or as we like to say, our thinker, our feeler, and our chooser. So that's our psychological part. And then our body is the third part, and that's the physiological part. That's the part that relates to the world around us. Now, all of these parts are interconnected. What affects one affects the other. And we don't have time to go into that in great depth tonight, but I believe that addiction is a soul problem. It has physical manifestations. No matter what kind of addiction it is, there's likely going to be a physical manifestation of it, but there's a spiritual solution. And so we need to look more at that. Then I have a definition that I came up with, and that is that addiction is a self-soothing, ritualized habit that is based on emotional pain, usually from childhood experiences, and can be destructive to the individual and to those around him or her. It is a coping skill, a deeply entrenched habit of desire and reward with its roots in unhealed emotional pain. The brain circuitry plays a part in the habit, but is not the cause nor the cure of the habit. So I want to go back over that just a bit because that was a mouthful. So when we talk about addiction as a self-soothing, ritualized habit, what that means is there is pain inside of the person who is choosing to go into addiction or who has gone into addiction. And this is a way of soothing themselves. The ritualized habit is something that I think a lot of us who haven't been in this kind of thing don't really understand. But especially when you're talking about drugs, there's a whole ritual that goes into it. The preparation of the drug to be in a form that can be used. I remember when my son, I let him live at home for a short time, and I found him passed out on the couch, and I found a piece of foil, and it had black smudges on it, and I had no idea what that meant. So he had had a shoulder injury. A drug dealer had beat him up, and he was given some opioids to deal with the pain of the broken collarbone. So instead of taking it in the appropriate way, what he did is he smoked it. So that was part of the ritual. He couldn't just ingest it the way that the doctor had intended. He had to do this ritual of smoking it and then passing out. So it's based on emotional pain, and we're going to talk more about that. Unfortunately, tonight we don't have time to go into a lot of details, and you may feel like you're drinking from a fire hose tonight, but hang in there. I know that John is recording and you can always go back. When we talk about it being destructive to the individual and to those around him or her, even if it's not drugs or alcohol that the person is addicted to, it is destructive. I tell the story often of a former mayor of the township that I live in. And this is when Atlantic City came in with the casinos. And he and a number of the higher ups in the township, unfortunately, became addicted to gambling. And as a result, they embezzled from the township, almost bankrupted the township. And when this became known, he died of a heart attack. He was, I think, 52, something like that. Had a bright career ahead of him. People were talking about governor and maybe presidential candidate. But he became so deeply entrenched in the gambling that he gave up everything and died in shame and guilt, and destroyed his family for such a long time afterwards. So as I said, it's a deeply entrenched habit of desire and reward with its roots in unhealed emotional pain. So the brain circuitry plays a part in the habit, but this is not a brain disease. It is not the cause or the cure of the habit. I want to talk about three types of or categories of addiction. The first is addiction to a substance, just as we've been talking about, such as drugs, alcohol, tobacco, food, or caffeine. And those of you who love your coffee, this is not to step on your toes at all. But unfortunately, caffeine is a bit addictive. I always add in there in my own mind, chocolate, and then, I don't know, you name it, M&Ms maybe, whatever. But seriously, drugs, alcohol, tobacco, and really food. We do live in a country where obesity is a major problem, and the health tolls are way up there. And unfortunately, people are trying to soothe the pain that they feel, or the fear that they feel, or the lack of fulfillment, lack of understanding as to why they're here and where they're going and what is my purpose in life. And so food can become as much of a drug, as much as we love food and we need it, but it can go overboard to the place where it becomes a substitute really for God. The second one is addiction to a behavior such as pornography, gambling, eating disorders, sex, sports, work, and shopping. Boy, there's so much in this one. These don't look the same. You don't see people necessarily on the streets of Kensington because of pornography addiction. But pornography is taking an enormous toll in this country, and not just in the secular world, but in the churches. And there was a Barna poll that was done a number of years ago, and I don't have the exact statistics, but I'm close on it. They polled pastors who, and they asked, and it was anonymous, they asked how many had used porn in the last few months. And it was something like 54% had done that. And then they also polled youth pastors, and it was up around 68%. So this is just a microcosm within the church itself. And pornography is ruining relationships, is ruining lives. Gambling, huge. Eating disorders. I never thought about an eating disorder as being an addiction, but it is. Sex, sports, work, shopping. Now, I have to admit, I do enjoy buying things on Amazon once in a while. But there are people who spend everything that they have and go into huge debt in order to get that bit of a high. I like to talk about retail therapy once in a while, but this is taking it to an extreme. The third one is addiction to relationships, such as codependency or abuse or domination of another person. In the work that I do especially with women in Love Them to Life, I see codependency so many times. And we don't have time tonight. Maybe that'll be another webinar someday. But codependency is as much of an addiction as the addiction of the person that you love. So I often say our loved one is addicted to drugs or alcohol, and we're addicted to our loved one. Abuse, we don't think of that as an addiction, but it's well known that anger is addictive, and people get that same high from a rage episode as they do from, say, having sex or something like that. The hormones that are released in that, and obviously there's other reasons for the abuse, domination of another person. And again, we don't have time to go into that tonight, but this is huge. And there's a man named Patrick Weaver who has a ministry for women who are being abused or have been abused. And I believe he's the one that has a t-shirt out that says that the church has a divorce problem, but there's a slash through the word divorce and it says abuse problem. And unfortunately, that is very true. And our churches are not really taught and equipped to know what to do in that situation. So I want to talk a little bit about the myths of addiction. And I really am not going to have time to go into a lot of detail on this. I do have 2 books, and I'll talk about them more at the end, but much of this information is in the books. But the first myth is that addiction is a disease. In the new book that I have, which is called Set Free, I devote a whole chapter to that. There are very scientific reasons that addiction is not a disease, but unfortunately, the common and idea about addiction is that it's a disease, and it's devastating to the person when that is what they believe. The second one is that addiction can never be cured. So once you're an addict, you're always an addict. The third one is that families need to, quote unquote, help their addicted loved one. I read a quote today by a woman named Lorelei Rosano, and she said, enabling isn't helping, it's escaping from uncomfortable emotions. The fourth one is, I was born this way. Whether that is genetics, people think that there is a gene for addiction. That is not true. There are personality types that may be inherited, and maybe somebody has maybe a tendency towards it, but we don't have to express every gene that's in our body. In fact, environment, they're finding out, is much more significant in the expression of the genes than the genes being expressed just on their own. The other thing is generational. Oh, well, my grandfather was an alcoholic, my father was an alcoholic, I'm an alcoholic. And unfortunately, that is a cop-out, and it's not actually true, but we're dealing with environment. So if you live in the chaos of a parent or a grandparent who's very big in your life, but especially parents who are in abuse, or in addiction, you're going to be dealing with trauma in the family. And that's a far more serious issue than any kind of genetics involved in it. The next one is, I'm only hurting myself. It's not true. It is never true. So people in addiction will say that all the time. I'm only hurting myself. Just lay off, Mom. But it's not true. The estimate is that for every person in addiction, there are 5 to 10 people who are deeply impacted by that addiction. I have been working with women who have loved ones in addiction now since 2013. And so I have talked with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of women. And I can tell you that that is absolutely not true. Every person who is in addiction is hurting other people. And the last one is, I'm calling this Just Stop It. So I don't know if any of you have seen the Bob Newhart sketch. And if you haven't, you must. So go on YouTube at some point. Just don't do it now, please. But look up Just Stop It, Bob Newhart. And you'll understand why I named it this. But there are many people that say, just stop drinking, just stop using. Like, why are you doing this to yourself? As if that's going to make a difference to that person. Chaplain Jim Freed, who used to be the director of the Colony of Mercy, used to say, people would come up to me all the time and say, Jim, why don't you just stop drinking? And he would go, why didn't I think of that? So that is a myth. So moving on, I want to talk about the roots of addiction. We cannot truly understand addiction until we go beyond the substances and the behaviors. Okay. There are 4 major roots of addiction. And I'd like to just list them. Rejection is the first one. And this is one that Dr. Solomon wrote about. Those of you, if you haven't read his books on rejection, very worth it. So any kind of rejection, and again, I don't have time tonight to go into a lot of the detail on that. But rejection is one of the most devastating things to happen, especially to a child. I think of Lisa Turkhurst, and those of you who know her ministry, she wrote a book called Uninvited, one of my favorite books on rejection. But she talks about how when she was a little girl, she wanted so much for her father to adore her, and when she would twirl around in her pretty dress, that he would love her and compliment her. And it didn't happen. And in fact, he ended up walking out from the family, left, never had anything to do with the family again. So rejection it cuts like a knife in people. Trauma is another root of addiction. There's so much trauma in our world, and it only gets worse. The more people leave that moral foundation of the Judeo-Christian heritage, at least, there's no moral standard. And so it's so much of, I'm going to do what I want to do, and I don't care if it bothers you or hurts you. And so we look at, it's called ACEs, which is adverse childhood experiences. And those ACEs, the more ACEs that a person has in their lifetime, especially as a young child, the more likely they are to end up in addiction. So there's the third one is rebellion. Sometimes people are raised in wonderful homes, and you don't see any reason why they have gone into addiction, but we all know what happened in the garden. And even looking before that, Satan's rebellion. So he set himself up for the eyes. I will be like the Most High. I will do this. I will do that. And that was the beginning of rebellion. But there are people who just decide they're going to do their own thing and they're going to make themselves happy. And it doesn't matter that it hurts somebody else. The fourth one, which I really think is at the root of all the other ones also, and that is shame. And so shame really can be seen as the most pervasive of all of the roots of addiction, and can be seen in all of those, the rejection, the trauma, the rebellion. Think back to the Garden of Eden. What happened when Adam and Eve took of that fruit that they were told not to, and they ate? What happened immediately? Shame. Shame came in, they hid, they tried to cover themselves with leaves. Shame became a part of our world at that moment, And it is in all of us. Like, there's not a person who has ever been born who does not have some shame. Now, some people have dealt with it, but shame, I think, is one of the least talked about, but the most pervasive thing that we do need to talk about. And so addiction is really a feeble attempt to solve the problem of shame, but it only accomplishes fueling the fire of shame. So addiction self-perpetuates. It creates more shame and more negative consequences that cause a person to try to numb their pain even more. So I just want to make a distinction for you real quickly. A lot of times we use the word guilt and shame interchangeably, and they're not the same. So guilt says that I have done something wrong. Shame says I am wrong. Like, there's something foundationally or fundamentally wrong with me. And so a lot of times we'll say, oh, I'm so ashamed of doing this. I got a speeding ticket and I'm really ashamed of that, or something like that. But that's more guilt. Shame is just a foundational feeling that I am less than, that there is nothing really good. And if you knew about me, if you really understood who I am, you would see that. So Stephanie Lee, you see the quote here, is a counselor in the Vancouver, British Columbia area. And she works with Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know if any of you have read any of his works or heard him on the TED Talks. He wrote In the Realm of the Hungry Ghosts on addiction. And I love this quote. It's so sad, but I love it. Addiction originates in a human being's desperate attempt to solve a problem. The problem of emotional pain, of overwhelming stress, of lost connection, of loss of control, of a deep discomfort with the self. In short, it is a forlorn attempt to solve the problem of human pain. Hence my mantra, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And I want to say that shame promotes addiction, but addiction perpetuates the shame. And so when you look at somebody who is in a spiral of addiction and they are just making horrible choices, their sense of shame just increases. And so it really becomes a self-feeding cycle. The more shame, the more addiction, because you want to numb the pain. The more addiction, the more shame, because you know that you're hurting people, you know that this is not how you want to live. You may end up in jail or prison. There may be all kinds of consequences that have happened. So I want to talk about how God sees addiction. Let's think back to the Israelites. When they left Egypt, and they entered the promised land, God was very clear with them. You will have no other God before me. But it did not take very long for them to begin to worship the idols of the people that were around them. They did not get rid of the people in the land. They allowed them to stay, some of them, and they began to intermarry. And before you knew it, they were worshiping the Baals and all of those idols in their lives. And we tend to think, well, that was way back then. Like, we don't have idols. We don't have images around. I don't have one in my office, I promise. But we tend to think that that's not for now. That doesn't happen. But it does. Because an idol is something that we turn to meet our needs. And it's anything that we place above God in our lives is an idol. So Dr. Carl Benzio has this quote: addiction is choosing or pursuing something other than God in a habitual, patterned, or repetitive way in order to meet a particular need, despite the inadequacy of the coping mechanism and the negative consequences that occur. And they do occur. I mean, that's a given. I always say, when I talk about legal issues, when I'm teaching parents, it's not a matter of if they will have legal issues, it's just a matter of when. So it is very, very, very rare for somebody who is addicted to a substance to not have legal issues, whether it's DUI, whether it's accidents. I was just reading a news update today that there was a guy who was in a drunk driving accident, and he now is spending 18 years in prison. The judge really threw the book at him because they wanted to make a statement. You cannot do this. 18 years, and he's a fairly young guy, so that seems like a lifetime. So there will be legal things that will happen. The negative consequences that happen in families, where families are destroyed. And then again, we talk about the generational things. What happens to the children that are born into a family where there is so much addiction? So when we talk about addiction as idolatry, addiction is a spiritual idolatry problem stemming from deep-seated soul issues that has a detrimental effect on the body, on relationships, on financial issues, and legal consequences. It is placing the desire for numbing inner pain above God, rather than finding true healing in God, thereby becoming an idol. So this all has been probably pretty depressing as we talk about this. But the reality is there are solutions for addiction. And the first one I want to talk about, and the most important thing, and this is one of my themes, is trading in our distorted identity for a transformed identity. So when we were born, we inherited that sin nature from Adam and Eve. And so we go through our lives and we oftentimes have a distorted identity. But when we meet the Lord and when we truly give our lives to him, that can change. Now, sometimes we have work to do to have that truly change, but our distorted identity does not have to be our real identity anymore. We can have that transformed identity. Galatians 2:20, one of the key verses of GFI, and really, to me, it's the key verse of the whole Bible. I have been crucified with Christ, and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. When we substitute our name for I, it really makes an impact. Cherri has been crucified with Christ, and Cherri no longer lives, but Christ lives in Cherri. The life Cherri now lives in the body, she lives by faith in the Son of God, who loved her and gave himself for her. It makes it so personal. When we truly understand the concept that when Jesus died, we died with him, and that we no longer have to live the self-life, it makes all the difference in the world. There's a praise song that I really like, and I'm not going to sing it, but it's got the line in it that says, "I'm no longer a slave to sin. I am a child of God." if we embrace that identity as our true identity, that we have been crucified with Christ, and it's his life. He lives in us, through us, and as us. He is our Lamb, our Lord, our leader, and our very life. And we do not have to live in our own resources anymore. And for somebody who is in addiction, truly embracing this makes all the difference in the world. These are not just words. This is life transforming. And so the distorted identity of a person in addiction can be traded in for a transformed identity. The other thing is doing the hard work of dealing with our pain, our trauma, our rejection, our rebellion, and our shame. So having that foundation of our transformed identity is the most important thing. But we have patterns. We have habits of thinking, habits of dealing with things. A lot of us have had trauma in our background, and trauma doesn't go away just by snapping our fingers. But trauma is something that goes so deeply into us, and God wants to bring healing to us. He wants to heal the feelings of rejection that we have experienced. And this rejection is not only with, say, a family situation, but you look at the amount of bullying that takes place these days. It is horrifying. And the number of suicides in teenage kids who just don't see any hope because they have been so bullied. So that's a big part of the rejection. To give up, as Oswald Chambers says, I give up my claims to my rights to myself. There goes rebellion right out the window. And then our shame, that deep sense of being flawed, of being less than. We don't have to live with that anymore. God wants to free us from all of those areas, and he wants us to heal. And I say this with the women I work with all the time. Yes, we want our loved one to heal and to come out of addiction, but we need to do the work. We need to be healed. And so dealing with the things such as enabling and codependency that is so common. And so I challenge all of you, if you are working in the field of counseling, guiding, ministry, any of those things, I think that we always need to be doing the hard work of dealing with our own pain, our own trauma, our own rejection, our own rebellion, and our own shame. I wanted to just mention, before we do some question and answer time, the first book that I wrote is called Besides Still Waters, Discovering Peace in the Midst of Your Child's Addiction. This one has been out since 2015. But if any of you are working with somebody who speaks Spanish, there is a version of this. And I see that my friend Xiomara is on the call. She did an amazing job of translating this. So it is, I'm probably murdering it, but it's Junto a Aguas. I forget the rest. Anyway, it is available on Amazon if you know of somebody who speaks Spanish, but this one is also available. And this is the newest one. It's called Set Free, Finding Truth and Hope When a Loved One is Addicted. And pretty much everything that I shared tonight is in this book. It's a much deeper dive into addiction, but if you have people that you know of who just don't read books, the first one is a good alternative. So I appreciate your attention tonight and for being here. And John, you want to handle the Q&A?
Sure. Would you like to comment on your website and contacting you?
Yes, thank you. So the website is lovethemtolife.com. Also have a Facebook page, which is again, Love Them to Life. And you can contact me at lovethemtolife@gmail.com. So I am available if you have questions, even after tonight, things that maybe we don't get to talk about or whatever, but I am happy to talk with people. If you know, especially of a woman who is really struggling with somebody that they love in addiction, feel free to send them my way. Monday nights, we have a Zoom group and women only. Somebody else needs to do the men's group, but God created that passion in me to work with women. And so, but if any of you have questions, male or female, I'm happy to talk on the phone with you. So anything that I can do to support you all, please let me know.
And your book is available as an ebook as well?
It is as an ebook, and the new book, excitingly, is going to be available on audio, most likely in the middle of May. So I have a friend who is donating his wonderful voice and his experience in doing audiobooks, and he's doing the whole thing as a donation to the ministry. So it will be available. But yes, the ebook, both of the books are available on in the e-version. So.
Well, on behalf of all of us, Cherri, thank you for your ministry tonight. And we look forward to a Q&A session to follow. And we invite those who have been watching to follow up by visiting lovethemtolife.com and availing themselves of these wonderful resources. Thank you for your writing, your books, your partnership and ministry, and the webinar tonight.
You're welcome.